Hi there, welcome to Pressure Point. I'm your host, Barbara Anderson. This week we take a look at multiculturalism in Canada with our special guest, Dr. Brian Teixeira, an intercultural consultant for churches in Canada. Welcome to Pressure Point, Brian.
Hello, Barbara.
Well, could you first tell us, I guess, a brief definition of multiculturalism? We hear that word bandied about so much. I guess it goes back to some time in our history a few years ago, but we talk about it so often, and I wonder if we all agree what it really means.
Well, I think it started becoming popular in the 70s, just about the same time as Canada was really dealing with bilingualism. And as we were looking at that, began to realize that not only was Canada English and French, the sort of two founding nations, but we discovered, especially in Western Canada, Ukrainians and Chinese and all sorts of other racial groups and ethnic groups. And it was about that time that people began to realize that while we might be a bilingual country, we weren't a bicultural country. We had many cultures here. And so around that time we started talking about multiculturalism, meaning that Canada was a country based on respect and a place for lots of different cultures, and in distinction from what the American approach was, which was to try and boil everybody down into some kind of hybrid American culture. And so over time then, we wrote that into the Charter of Rights, and then a couple of years ago, I think it was, actually had a Multicultural Act, so that at the government level, there's a recognition that Canada is made up of many cultures. It isn't one culture, or it isn't bicultural, it's multicultural.
Now, you mentioned the Americans just south of the border. Contrast a little more, if you will, our approach to multiculturalism and the American approach. What is this? There is a difference, and what is that?
Well, I think in the American situation, although social scientists might say that the sort of melting pot hasn't worked, and we've broken down in the United States with the black movement and the Native Indian movement, and within the church scene, black theology, red theology, and so forth, and now Japanese American theology, and so forth, that still at the official level, that kind of more pluralistic and diverse, and we might say multicultural approach to society is not an official position of the American government or policy. And while I think multicultural is becoming the fact in the United States, as it is in Canada, as it is, I think, becoming in many places in the world, the major difference, I think, between Canada and the United States right now is that we have seen what's happening and made it official policy and are moving with it, whereas in the United States that isn't the case. I think the official policy is still that there's some sort of American identity that everyone is supposed to be aspiring to be.
No, it used to be, say 20 years ago even, or maybe even 10 years ago, and there may be still people today who would say this, that why can't people who come to Canada leave their own troubles and concerns and whatever, their identity really, at home? Why can't they just come here and be, that's a thing that a lot of people say even today, why can't they come here and speak English and speak French and be like us? And yet there's something, I think, maybe a false assumption about that underlying it. I mean, we first came, speaking of myself, my own heritage came over and certainly didn't dismiss and adopt, say, the ways of the native people when we came here. So I wonder if you might speak to that kind of mentality that says, well, why can't people just come here and just be like everyone else, be Canadian?
Well, I think, like when you said about we coming here and not becoming like native people, I think that's true. In a sense, we're all, as one Native Indian friend said to me, we're all visitors that never left. And then we tend to see the next group of people coming as also visitors that would never leave. So appropriately, Native people might see the British and the French as visitors that came, weren't even invited, and never left, and probably came with dubious gifts. Mm-hmm. And then we see the Ukrainians that way, or we see the Chinese that way. And every group sees some other group as a visitor that won't go away. But I think the country is based on the assumption, at least the direction we're going right now, is that there's room for all of us, that all of us have gifts. All of us have something to contribute. And I think the direction we're going in is that the immigration, a coming of new visitors, if you want, is not only sort of a benevolent thing, a nice thing to do, but is essential for the future of Canada, that new people keep coming. Now, we wouldn't maybe want them to change their ways and become like us, but who is the us? Black people were here in the 1600s. some of the first settlers on Salt Spring Island were black people coming up on the Underground Railway from the United States. Native people have been around for 10,000 years. Chinese were here in British Columbia very early, and at one point there were more Chinese people here than there were European people here. So like, it's kind of a myth that, that this sort of so-called founding nations are the kind of norm for the rest of Canada. They certainly, in a sense, legally founded the country, but their dominance is a bit of a myth. Certainly it is the case right now. In Vancouver, people that would identify themselves as either British or French, single origin, I'm of British ancestry, are about 25%. 75% of this city would not identify themselves as either British or French. So who's the us?
That's a
You
good
know, and
question.
when was that us ever really there, you know?
So it brings up the term ethnic that we use a lot. We throw around another term we use is ethnic, and we talk about other people as being ethnic and not
Yes.
thinking of ourselves as ethnic. And I noticed one time when I first came to a meeting of United Church people and as they went around the room and listed their names, there wasn't one non-Scottish
Yeah.
or non-English name in the room. And yet we don't think of ourselves as ethnic in the
Yeah.
churches. I'm thinking of United Anglican churches.
Yeah. Yeah, it's certainly kind of a prejudice we might have, because ethnic would mean that we've got a certain traditional background, maybe religious background, cultural background. And yes, the Celts are an ethnic group, and Anglos, and they're all different ethnic groups. But we've usually meant ethnic for the ones who are not like us, and us usually means some sort of dominant group, and until quite recently has meant the founding, so-called founding nations.
Now, when we talked about the so-called founding nations of Canada, I wonder if the events that happened in this past summer with Meech Lake falling through with the aid of one of our native people, Elijah Harper, and then the whole crisis in Oka and that whole situation there, has that changed, do you think, the way we now look at, or the way we ought to be looking at multiculturalism and who we are as a nation?
Well, I don't know. If it's changed it, I hope it's changed in the direction of making us be more serious about it. I don't think it sort of in any way contradicts the need for multiculturalism, but brings a lot more urgency to it and a lot more realism, and people begin to realize where we need to be going with it. Basically, Native people are saying, at least the ones I've heard from, that some grievances that we've had for, in some situations, a couple of centuries, need to be rectified, need to be dealt with. And simply saying this is not important, or we just can't do this, or this is sort of unconscionable, isn't going to make those issues go away. I think we're forced now to put them in a realistic agenda and really deal with them.
Now, you're involved in two projects, two projects, I guess, that are dealing with multiculturalism in the church. I wonder if you could just tell us briefly what those two projects are and how the church is coming to terms with this reality of Canada that's been a reality for a number of years now.
One of the projects emerges out of the General Council that was held by the United Church in Victoria in 1988. And at that time, several conferences, I think about 5 conferences, petitioned General Council to have a consultation on multiculturalism so the church could look at what this means for the church and where it was taking us. That's been 2 years in the preparation process and will happen. The consultation will occur next year in May 8 to 12 at the School of Theology here in Vancouver. And the idea behind that is that there will be representatives coming from the 13 conferences, so the 12 kind of traditional conferences plus the new Native conference, and also representatives from the United Church Women. And they will attend this 4 or 5 day event that will both be a matter of learning more about multiculturalism, what's been happening, where it's going, and also how they can function as animators back in their conferences, so that this consultative process, looking at what it means for our theology and practice, looking at what kind of changes we might need to make in the kind of ministry we're doing, or new ministries we might need to add, that those people attending that consultation will then go back and carry on a kind of consultative, reflective, strategizing kind of process in their own conference. So I see it as sort of throwing a stone into a lake or something and starting the ripples. But that's scheduled to happen next May.
So there will be fallout from this as people go back to their congregations and their presbyteries and start to really bring an awareness about multiculturalism within that context.
Yes.
How will these people be chosen to go? Are they people with particular expertise or interest in that area?
Well, it'll be about 3 to 5 people from each conference. Each conference is going to figure out how those people get chosen on their own, but there were some guidelines that were set down, for instance, that they should have some skill as facilitator already. Like, we're not going to train them to be facilitators, we're going to maybe upgrade their skills a bit, upgrade their information a bit specific to multiculturalism, but they would already have to have some skill within that group, within that team that comes from the conference. We're suggesting that at least one of them be a visible minority, one of them be under 35 as well. I think those are, and that they have a mandate to go back and do this kind of groundbreaking in their own conference afterwards. So those were some of the guidelines given for choosing.
So that should be a very interesting consultation, but you're also involved in working with congregations individually, and what, if you could tell us about that.
Well, that's a new project. We're just getting the congregations together now. Initially starting with 6 of them in Calgary and 6 of them in Vancouver, in a sense that these 12 will be sort of like guinea pigs. And the goal would be, in working with these congregations, using church development skills and information and skills about cross-cultural training, intercultural communication, working with these congregations to see what helps them to develop a theology and a way of doing ministry that enables them to relate to the changing cultural, social, racial mix around them that's happening, usually in their neighborhoods and communities, but in some congregations, actually the congregation is also beginning to change. So using skills that have been used in the business field, that have been used by police departments, for instance, that's been used in the educational system, all sorts of systems in society are looking at what this means for them. So some of those skills that have been used in all those other kind of organizational settings, apply it to the church, bring some theological reflection, see what works and what doesn't work. What enables those churches to respond, either change the way they've been doing things so that they're more connected with the racial and cultural changes, or new ministries that respond to the new immigrants coming in, or issues within specific ethnic communities. Now, what we learned from those 2 cities, the 6 congregations in each of those 2 cities, then the hope is that 5 other conferences will also pick up those ideas and try them in their conferences for about another year. So the whole process would take about 2 years. The first year with this sort of 12 guinea pigs between Vancouver and Calgary, and then another year testing in 5 other conferences. And then hopefully at the end of that, have our own kind of understanding within the United Church of what it takes to make some of those transitions, to sort of transition the church so it becomes more aware, more sensitive to multiculturalism, and adapt some new kinds of ministry in the process.
A lot of people listening to this think, well, I'm aware of multiculturalism, I see it happening in my area, and my church is, when I look around I see there's a couple of people from a visible minority who are in the pews, and they think, well, we're taking it seriously. But what does it really mean to take seriously multiculturalism in the church? I mean, is it just having 1 or 2 people from a visible minority, or is it just opening up the doors on a Sunday afternoon to another congregation? What really is involved, do you think, if we really took this seriously?
Again, I would be sort of guessing what will happen here, but learning from other situations, looking at some things that have happened in the United States, for example, one of the issues that really gets raised is, for instance, in the United Church, we've got several dwindling congregations. Often those dwindling congregations are in situations where the ethnic makeup of the neighborhood, the surrounding community, is really changing. So some of those people feel, well, all we need to do now is sort of bring in these sort of new ethnic groups or new cultural groups or whatever, and they'll fit right in, and we'll sort of build our congregation back up again. And some people feel that is the goal. Others feel the goal is to allow all these different groups to have their own way of becoming church if they choose to do so. And there's a real tension in those two approaches within the United Church at this point. The experience from the United States suggests that trying to bring other racial groupings into one community doesn't work. And what may be happening, or what may need to happen, is that some of those dwindling, basically white Anglo congregations will have to die, probably, will just simply die out. But in the process of doing that, a variety of new ethnic congregations will grow up. So I guess I'm putting that as one scenario, which for some people could be quite upsetting, but is the scenario that the United States suggests to us, or several experiments in the United States suggest, that is where multiculturalism will lead us. It won't be a way of propping up the existing white church, but it could radically change the church into all sorts of various ethnic communities.
So what you're describing, though, is a real mosaic where there's a little group here and a group here and a group there.
Yes.
What connects those groups? What would be a connective?
And that's the second level then that really becomes the challenge. That was the other point I was going to mention. When that sort of variety or mosaic, as you said, starts happening in the church more, and it's already beginning, I mean, more and more groups joining the church as groups. What binds them together? In a sense, we've got our traditional way of doing it, our sort of way of making decisions, our rules of order, make a motion and do these other things that you do at meetings, our ways of understanding fellowship, our ways of theologizing that are sort of dominant, that are built into the United Church manual. Now, the theory, again, might be similar to the dwindling white congregation, that we'll bring all these people in and they'll all do it the way the manual said. That may not happen. We might have to become much more flexible in the way we understand decision-making. Our theology might become much more diverse than it is right now. Understandings of fellowship, understandings of worship. So the glue that will hold us together will also, I think, become much more diverse. I think that the face of the congregations, I think, will become more diverse, but also the glue that holds us together will have to be more flexible.
So the whole way we do things is up for grabs, or should be up for grabs, if we're really serious about inviting people in. We can't say to them, you have to do it our way.
Yeah.
We've got to be prepared to.
I think, because it's sort of like there's a transitional process. There's sort of a middle ground where people feel, well, if we can get them in and we get them to do it the way we do it. But that's still kind of an assimilationist point of view. We're still basically trying to assimilate them into an us. And I think multiculturalism goes the next step and says the us isn't a sort of white or an Anglo-French or whatever group that these are being assimilated into. The us is all these different varieties. And that makes for quite a different understanding of who we can be. When we talk about one faith and one church, but what that one faith and one church is going to look like is going to be lots of variety. I mean, one thing that comes to mind as I'm talking, I know within the Roman Catholic tradition, there have always been all sorts of rites. There's the Latin rite, which is the dominant one, but there's the Armenian rite and the Greek rite and the Ukrainian. I mean, that's one church, a huge international church, that's found a way to allow a lot of diversity and still have some sort of overall glue. And I think that's where Canada is going. And I also believe that's the world itself as we become more of a global village. This need to work together with more diversity is going to be increasing. The need for intercultural skills and more flexible organizations.
What you're saying really contradicts what a lot of people have thought, perhaps, that really the only difference might be language. Those people over there are worshiping separate from us because they speak a different language, and as soon as the second or third generation comes along, they'll all want to come over to our church. Now, what happens to second, third generation immigrants who don't have the language in common with their grandparents, but maybe don't quite fit in or feel like, where do they go? What
See,
happens to
again,
those?
that's one of the things we're going to have to see. The sort of experience I was giving you is what's been found in the United States. But I mean, on the one hand, there are people that feel, yes, by the third generation, they won't want to be identified as Japanese, let's say. They'll want to be identified as Japanese Canadian, but they still won't be some sort of no-name Canadian brand. And I think even some ethnic groups, minority groups, began to realize that no matter how educated they got, they still didn't look like the people in power, and so they still were different. And there still was a need for them to support each other, even though maybe 80%, 90% of them no longer spoke the language of their forefathers and foremothers. So I guess I myself am beginning to discover that sort of language alone is not the only thing that distinguishes ethnicity. I mean, there are cultural traditions and values and that also make for difference. Language is one part of it, a very important part of it.
You raised an interesting point just now. You talk about power, and that no matter what kind of changes some people make, they realize they will not be the ones in power. How do we then create an atmosphere or a whole church where the white Anglo-Saxon folks don't keep maintaining that power because they've started the structure? I mean, how do we share some of that power, I guess is what I'm saying, with folks who have come from different cultural backgrounds and who feel sort of on the fringe and may, if they're always sort of out there in little pockets, will always be on the fringe? I mean, how do you share power with people on the fringe?
I mean, I wouldn't know where, I mean, there's so much I could say. I mean, things, I mean, there's sort of like theological things you could say about that, you know, people discovering again that we are one people, we are one brotherhood and sisterhood, we're one species. Like there's that kind of education that needs to happen at a kind of conceptual level, I guess. In many situations, not just in the intercultural one or interracial one, but with other minorities, an important part of people breaking down that barrier was just meeting each other, spending time together. So I think part of, for instance, in working with these congregations, part of their discovering of the values and the importance of other racial groups is going to mean they're going to have to go meet them. They won't be able to, you know, there won't be a session that they can be told all that in a sit-down. They'll have to go meet them and discover them as people that have families, that have problems, that have, you know, very similar kinds of experiences in life, that may interpret things differently, but that go through a lot of the similar things together. So I guess the process of enabling people to just recognize each other as people, regardless of the racial background. That's a whole process, I think, of intercultural education, that you can go in different directions depending on where the people are at. I'm not sure where to begin with that one, yeah.
Well, you mentioned something about our theology and the diversity of theologies that we will have to incorporate in the United Church. The United Church has just recently gone through some kind of battle, I think, yes. Where a certain part of the spectrum on the United Church's theology has decided to leave. They didn't feel welcome. And I'm wondering how will that translate to some of our other brothers and sisters with different cultural backgrounds. Will they see that as, well, they are not welcome either, or there's only, our spectrum is somehow narrowing? What do you think of that?
Well, I think it becomes problematic only when there's a tradition that says, that doesn't allow for diversity, that says, I have the truth, or we have the truth, the final truth. And so if you don't accept this, then you're wrong, you're not a good Christian, you're not a... Rather than seeing it, this is our angle on it, this is what we learned from our forefathers, this is how we emphasize this. I think, to me, that would be the difference. So, and I think the struggle, as I interpret it in the United Church, has to do with how do we allow for diversity, have a theology that allows for that, and in a sense, confront, and if necessary, reject theologies that don't allow for diversity. And I think that's the struggle that we have gone through and are still going to be going through, but in another face of it right now.
I guess as we start talking about interfaith dialogue, that will become another crunch problem.
Pushes it even further, yes. Yeah.
How do you see the church in the year 2001, if we can look that far ahead, and if you indeed see a church or see the church in that time? What will it look like, do you think, if you could envision what it might or should look like?
Well, I think there's an iffiness about it. I think if the United Church doesn't deal with multiculturalism, doesn't face the reality that Canada is becoming a multicultural country, that the sort of heritage nations that are still fairly dominant within Canada and to some extent within the United Church, that the torch is being passed on. If we don't move with that, if we don't recognize that God is calling us to something special in all of that, that we don't catch any sense of mission in all of that, I think we'll be increasingly marginalized and become somewhat irrelevant to a lot of what is happening in Canada. On the other hand, I mean, if we do begin to realize that there's all sorts of people here that have a variety, and that there's some of them who wish to be Christian, that those who are Christian and have different racial backgrounds should be free to express their faith in ways that are appropriate to them. If they want to come up with, some people have talked about multicultural kinds of congregations, which are still a pretty theoretical animal, which would be you bring groups of people together from different cultures and try to make a congregation together. I mean, that still has to be tested. That's one possibility too. And then I think a whole sorts of other kinds of ministries that might not be congregational, but that are more responsive to the kind of variety that's happening in Canada. So I could see, if we do respond to it, then we become a much more diverse, many more different kinds of congregations and styles of worship, and other kinds of ministries that reach out to people that we haven't traditionally reached out to.
So if a congregation or someone listening to this program right now would like to get started in that, where would you recommend they get started at this point?
Well, the particular program, if they're interested in being part of that research project, they could contact the Center for Study of Church and Society at the School of Theology.
The Vancouver School of Theology.
Yes, and they would get some information from there. In terms of just general kind of education about multiculturalism and cross-culturalism, I think my suggestion to them would be to get in touch with, there are all sorts of organizations in the city. There's different committees for racial justice, or BC Organization to Fight Racism. There's different intercultural centers, and
so there are places in the city
to go in the community, and that way they begin to make contact with the people in the community that are actually dealing with these kind of issues.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Brian, for sharing that with us. I hope that churches do take up the torch and the challenge and make it to that year 2001. Thanks for joining us, Brian.
Thanks, Barbara.
And thank you for joining us on The Pressure Point. Good evening.